Yes, love's a secret weapon. Yeah!
Hi, I'm Donna Loren.
And I'm Dr. Adam Gerace.
And you are listening to Love's a Secret Weapon podcast.
Well, season 2, Donna, and they said it wouldn't last.
It's a brand new day, Adam. Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you, and Happy New Year to our listeners, because I think I speak for both of us when I say that we must thank our loyal listeners for their support as we launched Love's a Secret Weapon podcast in mid-2020. I think during so much change in the world, the podcast really came about as we both wondered what we could do to bring some creativity both to ourselves and to other people, how we could start to be part of a dialogue during so much change in the world. And, you know, I think this was a big part of your want to start this podcast, was to really start a conversation through your own story about issues that may affect many of us at the micro level, be that family, relationships with parents, relationships with partners, with children, or the macro level, you know, those societal changes that impact all of us. And, you know, many of which started, as we discuss, in the decade that this podcast is really somewhat about, which is the 1960s.
Oh, yes. Well, it's definitely a time of revolution. Even on a more intense level, we keep talking about the 60s as planting seeds. Well, the seeds are sprouting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the flower children concept of, you know, peaceful gatherings and we are all one is coming to be, even though we're all over the world experiencing so much division and so much polarization in our politics, especially in my country, in the U.S. And it's really I just had a personal experience, you know, with confronting this opposing kind of thinking.
Yeah.
And I tried my best to exercise compassion while I'm saying my truth. And not get into conflict. And so I think that's what this year and possibly most of this decade is going to be about, is transitioning away from the me philosophy into the we. The virus, you know, is definitely in position to, you know, to characterize that, don't you think?
Absolutely. I think it's a very, it's not a test that we wanted. It was not an experience we wanted, but it perhaps is accelerating what has begun and, as you've said before, sort of laid dormant for so long. And, you know, as that change comes through, like everything, there's always going to be resistance. But perhaps it's a sign that we can't keep continuing on the path that we are continuing on.
Yes, and I just wrote something on my Facebook page today, anticipating the Martin Luther King holiday that we in America celebrate coming up on January 18th. His birthday actually is the 15th. And what I was speaking about on my Facebook page in relation to this is that what does Martin Luther King and Gandhi have in common? And what that was is not a nonviolent approach to, you know, settling differences of opinion and coming together to create a solution for, you know, society and live more as a community. And so there was a point that I was making, Adam, about the faction of population on this planet that is totally amplified in my country about the concept of being invisible. And this idea that, you know, when you're born, as you're growing up and as you're developing in whatever, you know, situation you're in, whether it's a mother, father, or a single parent, that you are heard and seen. And when you are not really heard or seen for who you are, and I think you can relate, you know, you may have presented yourself in a way that made you feel safe, but could you really express yourself for who you really are? And certainly I'm asking you that question, but I'm certainly, paralleling my own experience that, I had to project a persona that truly wasn't my own to cooperate with the people that I was living with.
Yeah.
And so, to think about millions, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions, maybe who knows, just keep adding zeros, to the people who feel invisible. And that then I propose to you, Adam, that what I think that leads to is narcissism.
Yeah.
And, so it's becomes a distorted way of finding value for yourself, but in the extreme where it goes only to the me, not to the we. And therefore, the cruelty that we've been experiencing in my whole lifetime, in your lifetime, and many, many millennium, millennium. Yes. Thousands of years
for sure.
of cruelty. Where does that come from? It's like, wait a minute. If I can feel what you can feel, so that is where we're at now. I believe we're at that crossroads where between the virus, that the pandemic, which is the first one that has, touched everyone globally.
Yeah.
To our
in
knowledge.
our lifetimes. Yeah.
And the environmental issues of the global warming, etc. We are really on that threshold of coming together for survival and ultimately, for thriving as a community, as a global community. And wow, that, this is a big, big leap of faith in our time of living for such an incredible change.
And it's so true, I think, because when we think of that what's the opposite of me, and of course, as you said, it's we, but I think that breeds that compassion that you're talking about, that when we see ourselves as part of a common humanity and we see other people as being a part of that common humanity rather than ourselves feeling isolated, and that plays out in all sorts of maladaptive behaviors, but also seeing other people as not a part of us and seeing them as different and not a part of our group, or however we want to put that, then that halts compassion. It's when we can see ourselves and other people in that common humanity that I think we can move away from so much division, which has just characterized these last several years and beyond. And I think that's always been our sort of motto with this, is to try to bring, through your experiences, through some of my experiences, bring people in. And I know in 2021, we really want to open up that dialogue to you, the listener. And we have some initiatives that we'll share soon. But I just want to say, because I know, Donna, you wanted to open this sort of up to our listeners to begin, we'd love for them to share with us their thoughts on this episode or any of our other episodes. And if they email in to us at podcast@donnaloren.net, Donna will read them on our next episode or in subsequent episodes. So, we want our audience to think, have some of the experiences that we've spoken about been similar to the ones that they've experienced in their own lives. Maybe they have a story to tell about topics we've spoken about, whether it's the Vietnam War or the day that President Kennedy was killed. Or maybe they just like Shindig and they want to tell us about that. So, 2021 in that spirit of connection is really where we want to open up this podcast even more to those of you listening out there.
Right on. It's, we'll say the exclusiveness, which I'm interpreting as exclusion, becomes inclusion. So I do look forward to reading other people's, thoughts about subjects that we broach, and possibly, as I read our listeners' ideas and thoughts and comments, that I will choose one or two each episode at the end of our chat to discuss together. I'll read it and then we can chat over it.
Absolutely, that sounds great. And I think with that spirit in mind, I think we should begin our first episode of the new year. And to remind everyone where we last left off, we were really getting into your time working on Shindig. But what we need to, I guess, remember is that your primary commitment during those really busy days for you of working on Shindig and working on the beach party films, which we have some content coming up in a subsequent episode about Beach Blanket Bingo, but your primary commitment at that time was really to your contract with Dr. Pepper. And now we're going to pick up the story with some of your work with Dr. Pepper.
Thank you, Adam. It's really an honor and a privilege to share my life with you, Adam, and with all of our listeners. This is Chapter 8, Shakin All Over. While I was doing a lot of traveling for Dr. Pepper, the company was definitely trying to gain a more significant position in the national spotlight. They really amped it up. I began appearing and performing at open houses for new Dr. Pepper plants in cities all over the country. These new plants were a symbol of progress for providing new jobs. Many franchisors coordinated multiple soft drinks to be distributed from one bottling plant. At one opening in Las Vegas, Art Linkletter, my boyfriend's father, was there representing RC Cola. I was stunned when it came time to cut the ribbon because there was a bit of competition between my boyfriend's father and me. He knew me since I was 14, for goodness sake, but work is work. His competitive nature dominated that ribbon-cutting ceremony, and that was another time I just had to acquiesce. Bob, the third child in the Linkletter clan, was my first boyfriend. We met at the Deauville Club on PCH, the Pacific Coast Highway. The Deauville was like an old ballroom with a nice big stage, and it was right on the beach in Santa Monica. It was reminiscent of the Depression era, a la They Shoot Horses, Don't They?, referencing the shabby La Monica ballroom in that film with big arched windows that looked out onto the Pacific Ocean. It reeked of an era of Cole Porter and Irving Berlin. Now that same floor with the scuff marks of the tango and cha-cha-cha was transformed into the rhythms of Hitsville, USA. I distinctly remember rehearsing and performing Do You Love Me? Bob and his band, the Cornells, backed me up. They were a surf band, and Bob was the lead guitar. This is what they called a sock hop. Instead of dances from a bygone era, I watched all the kids on the dance floor doing the twist and the mashed potato, while I joined in twisting my heart out on stage. It was all very innocent and strictly platonic. Nevertheless, young love was alive and well. Bob invited me to his family's new home, a penthouse apartment at the Comstock Towers on Wilshire Boulevard, between Westwood and Beverly Hills. On the way, Bob stopped to show me his old house on Mapleton Drive in Holmby Hills, where he grew up. He explained to me that his father had decided to donate the property to the YMCA. The YMCA could then turn around and sell it and make the profit for themselves. We entered the elevator of his parents' new place and went to the top floor. His parents graciously met us at the front door and invited us to sit down for the dinner. What a contrast from my home on Grandview Boulevard, where Bob joined us at our very tiny dinette. Here we were in this spacious penthouse, seated at a grand dining table, his father seated at one end and his mother at the other. The phone rang and their maid brought it to the dinner table for Art to take the call from none other than the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk. All he had to do was turn his back, and we couldn't hear what he was saying. While Bob's dad took the top secret call, his mom, Lois, turned the conversation to her new, beautiful diamond engagement ring. In all the opulence, I recall when I first met Bob, I would see a crumpled piece of paper hanging out of the back pocket of his jeans. When I asked him what it was, he told me it was his job to deliver his father's paycheck of $38,000 a week to the bank. His dad hosted the TV show People Are Funny. I knew both sides of Bob regarding his values, and sure, he was from a wealthy family, but he was always down to earth with me. 3 years into our relationship, he was so proud of my accomplishments in my career that he talked my parents into letting him take me to his friend and bandmate Pete Lewis's house to watch Shindig together. When I came on to sing my song, he lifted me above his shoulders. FYI, his friend Pete's mom was Loretta Young. In my travels for Dr. Pepper, I recall going to a small southern town in Arkansas called Paragould, with a population of about 10,000 people. Here was a Dr. Pepper bottling plant opening that serviced a region including Paragould. When I arrived in Little Rock, it was an icy road day. Therefore, I was greeted by a police escort for my safety. The roads on the countryside were mounded up, so the snow fell into the ditches on either side. Still, thin sheets of ice lined the roadway, and it took an expert to navigate. A very accommodating police officer drove carefully past scenes that one could only imagine. All along the road, perched on a higher mound, were little brown shacks. Some had porches with rocking chairs. Some had refrigerators, which the police officer explained was a status symbol that showed neighbors that they had electricity. A few had a car parked in a driveway that was only a cleared dirt path adjacent to their houses. And one had a Cadillac, the supreme status symbol in the mid-1960s. To my horror, I saw rivers of urine flowing between the houses, also symbols of dire poverty. The cultural exposure I was receiving only opened my heart more for what was to come. Finally, when we arrived at the bottling plant site, a parade of people were patiently awaiting the event. One young man rode in on his mule barefoot. Almost the whole town showed up for this celebration, plenty of them anticipating jobs that would provide future employment. I stood before the red ribbon I was to cut and gazed out into the crowd. The scissors' sharpness cut through with my first attempt. Now it was officially opened, and we were ready to party. Everyone filed through to see how the thousands of sterilized bottles were conveyed on a belt to be filled with a delicious bubbly beverage recommended at 10, 2, and 4 o'clock, those times of the day when you just might need a friendly picker-upper. By midday, a high school band joined me to sing for the people of Paragould. It was filled to capacity. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles was extremely popular then, and I exchanged Sergeant with Doctor to sing a song that was topping the charts and heard widely on the radio. I performed for my usual 40 minutes, including songs like Summertime, Cotton Fields, Money Can't Buy Me Love, and There's a Kind of Hush. Quite a variety of American and British invasion music. The response I received was very generous. Afterward, I parked myself at a table to sign autographs, which was a common custom at these events. The line of people snaked outside the building. For 2 hours, I greeted every single person, making eye contact with each one. The young man on the donkey stood in line barefoot. He was getting close to the front of the line, and I noticed his complexion. His face was erupted with acne, and I had great empathy for teenagers with this condition. My own skin had been compromised by all the pancake makeup I used for TV and photography. I had a keen awareness, therefore, that we had probably had some things in common, not only being roughly the same age. His turn was next. I looked at him and smiled. He looked back at me as if to say, "Would you ever consider kissing me?" He stood quietly before me as I reached out and handed him an autographed picture. Instead of letting him think that his grand prize was a photo of the Dr. Pepper girl, I asked him to wait. In that moment, there was a compassion between us, one that I decided should be demonstrated not with a conversation, but with a kiss. Opportunities to connect an expression of unity like this afforded me during my travels with Dr. Pepper were golden. I've always looked for and trusted in a sense of oneness and a common denominator. A trip to Winslow for Dr. Pepper was a big deal for me because I had never really been in that part of the country. It was an introduction to my awareness of the Native American culture. First, we were picked up in a red convertible from a little airport in Winslow and driven parade style to where I was greeted by the Hopi chief and invited to dance in a Hopi circle. The tribe gave me a Kachina doll that my parents treasured and kept on a shelf in their home. Eventually, it was passed on to me, but by then the dusty doll had lost its luster and parts of its limbs. That was a magical link at the time to introduce me to the region of northern Arizona, which became a significant part of my life later. It's still in my heart, and I'm very fond of that part of the country. Some other appearances for Dr. Pepper were not necessarily as poignant, but memorable for other reasons. During a visit to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, I was taken on a tour of a golf course. It was May, and so I was wearing a sundress. What I didn't know was about the chiggers, ticks, that attach to you and are likely to be found in warm and humid climates. After reaching the 18th hole, I had at least 30 bites on my legs. The only way that I could remove the stingers that they had left was with nail polish. So I had to swab each one with my clear nail polish, causing the stinger to retract. My legs were covered in lumps and bumps because of the toxic effect that the chiggers had on me. When I was being photographed for the front page of a local newspaper, I must have had that chigger venom in me because I was photographed while touching my tongue to my nose. Another appearance is significant in my memory. Maury, my dad, and I went to St. Louis for Dr. Pepper. The usual environment for a Dr. Pepper event was held in a bottling plant to celebrate its opening. This particular event was held outside on a stage in a park-like atmosphere where I drew single-handedly a crowd of 10,000 people. It was very intense. At this stage of my career, I had had a lot of exposure through television and movies, which probably contributed to the format Dr. Pepper chose for me this time. Another distinguishing experience at this time was being taken up in a helicopter to see the Gateway Arch on the Mississippi River. I clearly remember going on this ride without my dad as an extracurricular activity. Most likely, the owner of the Dr. Pepper plant was also the pilot. Obviously, the cabin only had room for one passenger. My hair was in an updo with dozens of bobby pins and hairpins holding it up. The door in the helicopter was left open, so as soon as we took off, wind whirled into the cabin and all my bobby pins flew out. Mark Twain is a proud son from the state of Missouri. His story, the celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County, must have influenced me during that trip. I was taken out to dinner where I had my first and last frog legs. When I was home in LA, my daily routine consisted of working at least one primary job, if not multiple. Rehearsing and taping for Shindig, recording for Capitol, or maybe both in one day. The way my mother took notes in my diary was usually very clinical. She mostly noted where I would be going and what I would be doing when we were leaving, all the comings and goings, and even some of the fees I would be making. Of course, she didn't go with me most of the time, so she didn't have any of the details. For one entry, however, concerning a trip to Chicago to do a show for the Theater Owners of America on behalf of AIP and perform songs like Get Happy, Everybody Loves Somebody, and my old standby, Bill Bailey, She noted that I would be meeting a few days before the AIP's Milt Moritz to rehearse Shit for Chicago. Shit? So that's how she really felt. In retrospect, it does my heart good to see my mother tell the truth, even if it took me decades to discover it. Our relationship was cloaked in so much deception. She probably never dreamed I would ever see how she truly felt when she was journaling. Well, the truth has a way of showing itself eventually, and when I finally inherited these diaries of my career, it was evident on the page in her own writing.
Wow, so much to unpack there. I distinctly remember when we were sort of working through this part of the story, and actually you opening one of those diary books from this time that your mother had kept, and actually finding that note that she had put in there, and you know, I think just the conversation that we had about it, and that whole idea of what that kind of represented in you know, one little turn of phrase. But and it's and as an aside, you know, Milt Moritz, who worked at ARP as the head of advertising and publicity, he was the person sort of behind, you know, some of that advertising for Beach Blanket Bingo, which I know we're going to speak about in our next episode, where I think the tagline for that was, "When 1,000 bodies hit 500 blankets." So an expert at publicity. And for our audience who's perhaps fans of some other work, they might be interested to know that his son Neil Moritz is the producer of all the Fast and the Furious movies. So you know,
Hereditary.
The ability to reach the teen audience really continues in that family. But I want to, you know, I really want to break down what you were speaking about in a lot of ways, because I often talk about how when we've had a similar experience with another person, it breeds a sense of empathy, or as we were saying at the beginning of this episode, compassion. And I think there's two parts to that really reflected in your reading. And the first one's with Bob Linkletter. Now, Bob's life was quite different from yours materially, but I wonder if some of the issues that he faced with his own father, Art Linkletter, in particular, you could relate to.
You know, I have to just recall what Bob told me, because I think that my father, you know, and my adopted dad ended up being living for 4.5, almost 5 years in an orphanage because of his mother's illness, and his father had to work. From the age of 4.5 to 4.5 to like 9 or so. And I believe that Art Linkletter spent time in an orphanage at a young age as well.
Okay, right.
And you know, I remember Bob sharing that with me, and there was some affiliation with YMCA, which is probably why he decided to give back, you know, his home to that organization, you know, as a form of gratitude.
Yeah.
So linking the two fathers' childhoods together, you know, people behave differently when you are deprived of this kind of sequential, you know, development in childhood. Yes?
I know we've spoken about this in other episodes, that whole idea of that foundation that's built in childhood around, you know, safety, or feeling that you have a secure base from which to explore the world, and those experiences, sometimes whether it be a death of a parent, or an abandonment, whether it's a, you know, a so-called deliberate abandonment, or one that happens by circumstance. You know, in your adopted dad's case of his mother being ill, and he and his brother Lou having to be put into an orphanage for a few years, or I guess in the case of Art Linkletter, though I don't know the particulars of his story, that can often compromise that development of that understanding of the world and that ability to feel safe or to feel that one's needs can be met, and along those lines.
So that
For sure.
kind of helps me explain why, even though he knew me, at that ribbon cutting ceremony, that whatever happened, in his own life about being competitive, here I am, I don't know, maybe I was 16, 17 at the time. And, he was a successful man, adult, whose competitiveness or whatever, I don't know how to explain, what the source of that competition was. But rather than, bowing to a young lady, shall we say, and giving it a courteous, being a courteous person, he kind of bullied me. He kind of pushed me aside a little bit so that he could take the spotlight and get the attention.
I hadn't thought about it that way in terms of thinking of what, drove that. I mean, I know you speak often, and we will in the future, about, certain predominantly male figures who you came across sort of again and again, who would often, attempt to demonstrate that dominance. But I think, it's something, that looked as innocuous as a ribbon cutting, to sort of look at what perhaps drove that, particularly given he knew you. This wasn't just business. He had known you for a very long time by this point.
Yes. And the idea, that I said, and I had to acquiesce again. What I mean by that is to be non-combative, to decide that if someone needs something, as I understood that my mother and Maury needed certain things, that I have to say, coming in as an empathetic soul, coming in with, and I'd like to go deeper into that, having an empathy that's so deep that even as a very small child, you in essence acquiesce to someone else's needs. And I think that's just how I came out. But so many of us on planet Earth, as I understand, and we can go into this a little bit, because I know your specialty in your field of psychology is dealing with empathy. And that is one of the primary reasons, other than I love you and that, I just really enjoy sharing my life with you, is that, you've always had a wonderful understanding and empathy for me. And I hope that you feel that I have returned that.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And what I understand is that there are some of us that come to Earth, and I hope that it's many, many of us, that when we inhabit our new life, when we start developing in the womb, that we maybe have a greater ability to go beyond our five senses. In other words, have an intuition, have the ability to see farther, where in some cultures, you're damned for that. You're condemned for seeing that much. And in other groups, you're praised for it. It's like, tell me what you see. I can't see that. And I think that's another phase of what we are approaching in this 2021, is the ability to have more of that visionary ability. And so going back to an empathetic soul. So in dealing with empathy, you're dealing with your five senses. You're dealing with your sight, your sound, your smell, your taste, your touch. Things that aren't visible, that you can't prove scientifically, but that are there. For instance, let's say in a dream, that you have a visit from a deceased person.
Mm.
You have a visit, and in your dream, that person is so real. Where does that come from? And can you trust that?
Mm.
Can you trust it
Mm.
as some other dimension manifesting so that, you're going beyond your five senses?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? That dream of whether you see it as going beyond those five senses or coming from somewhere else, or even if we see it, and there's certainly the research suggesting that the way that we work through relationships is often through dreams. I know we've spoken about this before, but it does really highlight that bond that we have with people, that empathic bond that we have with those that we're involved in, and sometimes it plays out in dreams, a kind of concerns we have when we're awake, when we don't quite know how to process. I think sometimes come out in that nighttime.
And what I understand is that when you have those other abilities, but you're in society and you're in this 3D world, that there is a shrinking of the senses that give you that other potential. There's a shrinking to fit in to the five sensory world.
Yeah.
And like I say, some circles accept it more than others, and the ones that do accept it, I think, are expansive, and can go to the mountaintop and just see more, as an ability to kind of trust their own sensibility of what path they should take. In my little song, Love It Away, it's like I talk about that inner voice, and you hear so many people now talk about listening to your inner voice, listening to your heart. And that too, is so essential. It's actually crucial to go to your heart. The ideas that come into your mind, drop into your heart and let your heart tell you if it's true or not before you let your mind make the decision for you. Because
I think you're really honing in on there's and I'd like to, I think we should probably devote a future entire episode to this, because just when you say that, I'm thinking of a couple of things. And the first is that inner voice, that the ability to harness that inner voice, but to see it for what it is as well, and to separate that voice that helps us to know what to do and who to trust, and something beyond what we see out in the world. But the difference between that and, say, our inner critic, that very critical voice, which can be a source of good judgment and a source of good advice, but can also go into that hypercritical phase. But also just out in the world, when you talk about when someone's empathic, when someone at a very early age has that ability to feel what other people are feeling, or to hone in onto what they are experiencing, how sometimes that empathy can go into self-sacrifice, where because we feel so much for other people, we take on so much their emotion. It also means that we lose our ability to either know or to honor what we want, what we feel, what we think, because we acquiesce, as you said, whether it's with someone representing RC Cola, or whether it's our parents or our caregivers.
Yes.
And when we see Bob Linkletter, for example, this idea that I think he perhaps, I didn't know him, and I know eventually he wanted to, he was doing he was in the Cornells with Pete Lewis. He did his own music briefly. I know he worked with a couple of quite prolific Californian surf producers, Bob Hafner and Tony Hilda. But eventually he gave that up and sort of, I guess, did what his father perhaps wanted him to do, which was to become a businessman. And, it kind of seems that perhaps he had that struggle himself between what other people wanted and perhaps what he wanted to be.
Of course, he's been gone for many years, and he passed away at such a young age, only 35. But and I never had any contact with him once I was married and so forth at 21. But what I think happened is that he was younger than his brother Jack. And his brother Jack, as I recall, was the prototypical, golden boy for his father, and took on his father's legacy and his image. And Bob really, wanted to pursue his own interest. Which another comment I have to make is that in the music world, to be honest, like in any world, but especially in the music world or in the arts, you look at a very small percentage of successful artists in any one of those chosen fields. And, really so many, I would say probably 90 to 95% of all musicians, only make it to a certain point on that ladder of success. So for Bob, I feel that, if he couldn't reach, some satisfaction of success, that he would, he would gain the admiration and approval of his dad to have his own separate expression, that he would just conform, to win his father's approval.
Yeah, that's. I was reading a little bit about Bob, in preparation for this, and I know there was a lady who did some music work with him, and she kind of wrote on her website that at some point he lost interest in music. And it's interesting your insider's sort of perspective of knowing that situation of perhaps, when he couldn't reach those lofty heights that his father, of course, did for 60, 70, however many years Art Linkletter was doing his thing, that, perhaps that conformity kicks in. But I think when we're talking about this empathy based on shared experience, obviously that, of course, has its place. But I think you mentioned that some people are just born with that empathy muscle, I guess I call it, that empathy muscle to go beyond being able to understand their own peers or contemporaries or what they see right in front of them. There seems to be that empathic connection that some people just have. And I think for you, that empathic connection you had with people, when you toured with Dr. Pepper, regardless of socioeconomic differences or age or race or gender or whatever else, I think that was probably your secret weapon, that ability, that's demonstrated when you went to Paragold, where you went elsewhere, to be able to connect on some, maybe you'd call it a heart level, with people who perhaps were quite different.
Yeah. It's just kind of remarkable, when you think about the idea of different. Even, I mean, growing up, I was kind of talked into thinking that I was special. I didn't like that either, because, later on in my life, for anyone that's into astrology, I had my birth chart done. And when I realized that I had some aspects of what they call Sagittarius, in Sagittarius, there is a quality of really, we are all one. And you can come in to learn that in all kinds of ways, or you can come in to teach that. And when you have that quality, you somehow it's deeper. It's just deeper than the surface. And whatever was going on inside me from such an early age, and maybe even in the womb, that I started this ability to, yes, it may have been sacrifice, and I know that there's still lots of stuff inside me that needs to be worked on. I mean, there's still a child in there that, needs some attention. But the idea of having something in common, some common denominator, I just always looked for that, and I still do. I always try to go beyond what's different and stop it there. Now, there are situations where I'm not given the chance, and that's where people really who do want to look for that common denominator, they read, and that's another quality of an extra, empathetic soul, that you're able to read that person so that you do not enter conflict when you realize that there's a limitation. And you
Absolutely.
then the compassion, that's when compassion for someone who recognizes that person that you want to find a common denominator with, doesn't have the capacity at that moment. And that's where love is essential, because everybody feels love. Everybody. I mean, when you look at your dog Lucy, she knows you love her. You don't have to communicate, in a lot of different ways. It's a look, and it's the same way with human beings and all kinds, all life. But we are really, really, really in transition now, and it's just an amazing time to be alive on planet Earth.
That's such a, I think, important thing to say, that with everything that's going on, and so many of us get despaired and just think this is what is happening and how much worse can this get. But there is opportunity in that as well. And, I think it's kind of very, perfect timing. I know late last year, you released onto YouTube, and it's also available on iTunes and Spotify and all the usual places. But your song Love It Away, you released a remix of it for its 10th anniversary. And I think that sort of anthem for these times is really needed more than ever.
It was my it was my joy, when I received a call from a friend who said, gee, I like that song, but here we are, the message is great, but I'm alone in my house, and I want to dance. I can't go outside, at this time to, have the liberty of exercising and going out and walking and so forth. So I want to dance in my house. Could you change the rhythm of your track? And my dear friend Maurice, lent a hand and engineered a new rhythm track. And so that was like a Christmas present. It was truly a gift. And yes, and those messages, when they come, I think, because I've written a handful of songs in my life, and for Bob Dylan and the likes of Dylan, and made songwriters that write for their entire life. They all know. And going back to the classics, Mozart could not have written a 350 part symphony without erasing a note for, at such a young age, that, that energy comes from somewhere else, and it comes through you, and you're the facilitator, so
Absolutely.
That message came through to me, and I'm just so grateful for it. And it's a tool for me to vocalize and and theorize, and and hopefully just communicate to you and to our listeners and to anyone else that is open to that message of love. It's my favorite 4-letter word. L-O-V-E.
I was wondering where that was going to go, and I'm pleased.
Yes, of all the 4-letter words, that is my favorite.
Love is a 4-letter word, as they say. But I'm so pleased to be back doing this what we do, and having this conversation again in the new year, because I think it's so important to us, and we get so much out of it, and I hope anyone listening out there gets so much out of it as well. As always, as we said, we'd love to hear from those of you listening about what you think of this episode or anything else we talk about, as Donna's 1960s column in a magazine advised us. Let's talk
Indeed.
it
Oh, Adam, it is a great pleasure to begin this year with you. And let's just keep our seat belts buckled.
over. Absolutely. Until next time.
Yes, love.